Well, good morning if you are in Los Angeles, California, Hollywood, California. Good afternoon if you are with me in New York City. Good evening if you happen to be in Rome or Milan or on the Po River. And greetings to people in Ukraine, greetings to people in China, greetings to people all over the world who watch Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio, as you well know, is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to music lovers all over the world. My guest today, Christine Lamont, joins me from, I don't know if you prefer to say Los Angeles or Hollywood or the movie capital of the world or whatever you prefer to say it. But Christine is a film producer who produces films that I care about. Let's put it that way. And I've known of her work for a while, and it's something that my listeners care about too, because she does a lot that's focused on Italy, a lot on classical music and on opera. And before I turn to Christine, I'd like to mention something to listeners that this program is being broadcast on March 28th of 2025. It's being recorded earlier on February 21, 2025. And the reason I'm telling you the dates is that so much is happening in Christine's life in terms of the two films that we're going to talk about, plus the third one I want to ask about, that what we say on February 21st may be completely different by March 28th in 2025. So, Christine Lamont, welcome.
Oh, Fred, so great to be here. Thank you so much. Looking forward to having a conversation with you today.
So, people would think that I would start with a discussion of Verdi, but I'm going to start with a discussion of Puccini, and then we'll go back to Verdi. Um, and I want you to give listeners the time frames of when things are being presented and produced. But you just recently were at the Santa Barbara Film Festival with two of your films. Let's call them the Verdi one and the Puccini one. The
Right.
Puccini one is Ai Weiwei's Turandot. Now, we know that the opera Turandot was written by Giacomo Puccini and is based on fables from the Venetian tradition about China, about princesses, about love, and about all kinds of things. Um, and Ai Weiwei is one of the world's most famous artists. And how did he get involved with doing a production in Rome of Turandot, and how did you get involved in doing a film about it?
Well, first of all, how blessed am I to be working on two projects, Verdi and Puccini? It's for me, it's been heaven. Um, so Ai Weiwei is a very interesting artist. Obviously, he's an incredible artist, but he loves doing things that are difficult, that are unusual. His biography is a graphic novel, for instance. So when he was approached by the head of the Rome Opera House to do an opera, he said, "Well, okay, but which opera do you have in mind?" And they said, Turandot. And he said, okay, that sounds right to me. So he embraced it. And he said to everybody when he met them, I don't know anything about opera and it's very difficult. And that's why I'm doing this. But this is my first and my last foray into the world of opera. So
Hmm?
for some people, that's daunting. For other people, it's questionable, right? But he came in, he created the most beautiful production design imaginable. He created the costumes, he created the projections that are on screen that reflect modern day plagues, the war of Ukraine, immigration, COVID, and modernized a beautiful, already incredibly, and opera turned out that a little over 100 years ago, right? It was
1924.
right? 1924, right.
Hmm.
So he brought his own activism and artistic vision to this, and he created a new character, a Chinese character that interprets the internal emotions of what's going on the stage, which is so beautiful. I love that he did that. It was brave and bold, unusual, maybe I don't know, another questionable thing for opera purists, but it works and it's beautiful. So that's kind of how we got involved. And Maxime Derivenko, this is a very interesting thing. When I did Viva Verdi in Milan, I had been living in Rome, and one of my friends said to me, "We have this young filmmaker. He's 21. We think he's good, but we're not sure." And I said, "Well, let me meet him." I had taught at the School of Visual Arts. I'm used to teaching emerging talent. So he came over. I saw his film, and I said, "No, you're not just good. You're incredible." So he had this student film that we worked on, and he submitted it to festivals, got in, and won awards. And when Yvonne Russo, who's my producing partner and the director of Viva Verdi, called me, she said, I have this project. I think you might love it." And I said, "Okay, what is it?" And she said, "It's Verdi. It's this home for retired opera singers. It's in Italy." And I said, "Say no more. It's perfect. It's all the things that I love." So we went up 2013, a long time ago, and we did some development reel. We shot a couple weeks and developed a reel. And I said to Maxime, "You have to come up and be our cameraman." So Maxime came up, was our cameraman, and Federico Rodelli, who we'll talk about shortly, who directed my Poe documentary, Children of the River, he was a PA and eventually did so much work for us over the 10 years.
Just because not everybody works in movies, and we have
Okay,
viewers all over the world, a PA is a production
right.
assistant.
Production assistant.
Okay.
He may have even been still in school, but he brought so much to us and brought so much to the table, opening doors for us. He's our man on the ground. He lives in Parma, so and he loved Verdi and opened up to all these doors. He ended up as a co-producer of the film, as well as a cinematographer, as well as like a million other things that he helped us with. So those two young filmmakers are the two other films that I have right now as my three Italian films. Interesting. So that's kind of how it happened. So Yvonne and I did a development reel. We raised funds, went back two other times, and so we had a nice arc over this year. We followed, over those 10 years, we followed five of the residents at Casa Verde, which
Well, I know that we're going to get into Verdi, but I want to stick right now to the Turandot
sorry,
because I think it's important. Um, if I'm correct, they began rehearsals in 2020, and
that's
then the
right.
pandemic hit.
That's
And
right.
when they were able to come out of the pandemic, that's when Russia invaded Ukraine.
Exactly. March 28th, actually. And so
Okay.
what
Was
happened,
it February 24th? I somehow thought it was February 24th of
oh, was it?
2020.
Yeah, could have been, could have been. So Maxime is this interesting young talent. He grew up, his father was a Russian ballet dancer who defected from Russia. His
Mhm.
mother was a prima ballerina on the Rome opera stage, and his grandfather, was the first violinist. So for him, he grew up with the arts. He grew up with arts being challenged. So he understood a lot about Ai Weiwei's work in truth. So he had been the video and film head at the Rome Opera House for 7 years. So he worked with Sofia Coppola when she directed. He worked with all the great directors, Robert Bole, the dancer.
Roberto Bole, yeah.
Exactly. So he grew up with this in his blood. And he said, "I'm here every day on this stage where my grandfather, my mother, and something's coming to me." And soon, when he heard about Ai Weiwei and Turandot, he said, "This is it for me." So he approached Ai Weiwei, and Ai Weiwei and he got along really well. And he said, "That's a good idea. Let's do it," which is unusual because Ai Weiwei is very private about his process. And Maxine was able to have access, really lovely access, to understand some of his process working with other
Mhm.
creatives, other craftspeople. So that's kind of how it happened. And so they started in 2019, and then to 2020, when the announcement came about COVID and everything was shutting down, everyone was devastated. And for Ai Weiwei especially, he said, "Art is my home. and now I have nowhere to go. And he talks about that. And so it's covered a little bit in the documentary. So they stopped briefly. And then when they were able to come back, they wanted to, and I wasn't involved. I knew about the project because I was with, I talked to Maxime all the time, but it was kind of a separate thing. I was involved with some other things. But then he said, I'm coming to New York to do an interview with Cheng Ching. I want you to come on board as a producer. And I said, all right, sounds great to me. And then Marta Zaccarone, my producing partner in Italy with Insipid Films, we formed a co-production. And forming a co-production helps you to raise tax funds in Italy. And also it helps in many ways. So we formed a production company and
Let's
we
say who Chang Ching is. I know who she is.
right. So Cheng
I met
Ching,
her in 1987.
she's amazing. Cheng Ching is this incredible choreographer, and there's so many concentric circles here when you think about it. So Cheng Ching worked with Zeffirelli, Franco Zeffirelli, on La Traviata and Turandot in 1987, I think it was,
Yep.
and Ai Weiwei
So
was
did I, actually. That
yes.
that's where I connect to this. Yeah.
So Ai Weiwei
Yeah.
was an extra.
Yep.
She brought him on as an extra because she knew his father. So he came on as an extra. And there's these great photos of him in his outfit. And I think Franco Zeffirelli said, "Well, you look Chinese. You can play the part. Fine, let's go."
Mhm.
So he became an extra. They're very close family friends. So they maintain this relationship. So when Ai Weiwei was doing this Rome opera, he called Cheng Ching and said, "You have to come on board. I would love you to work with me. There's such a great circle here." So
Mhm.
hey, she's lovely, and so she came on board, and there's great video and great footage in the film of them working together, and you can see their relationship. It's sweet, it's fun, it's they have a shorthand. So that's kind of how she got involved. So I came on board at that point, and then I started getting very involved. I bring my marketing. I was a marketer at Universal Disney and Orion, so I brought my marketing acumen and other things to the table, and we go a little faster than a lot of other in Hollywood. It's like it's work. You just go fast, and there are barriers, and you just jump over them, or you jump through them, or whatever you have to do. And a lot of other European companies or organizations or even the film people are just a little bit different. They work a little differently, and our hours are different too. So a few challenges, but I'm a night person. I'm a morning person. I have a lot of energy, so I was able to stay up until midnight to get them at 9 o'clock, and I would get up in the morning early to have meetings. So never a problem for me. I love that I was able to work that way. I love to work, so it was great for me. I think Fred, you're the same. If I think that you and
Oh
I
yeah.
line together late
If
at
I
night.
may, what I'm going to do is give listeners some background because before you and I ever came to know of each other, um, I was very connected to this story anyway. I'm connected to both stories of both of your films, and perhaps all three, which is why one of the reasons I wanted you to join me today is that I, in the 1970s, as a student in Italy, in Bologna, in Parma, in Verona, in Milan, and Pavia, um, my last job was to be the assistant to Giorgio Strehler, one of the greatest directors. But one of my previous jobs, I was at the DAMS, Dipartimento di Arte, Musica e Spettacolo, which is sort of like Italy's Juilliard at the University of Bologna. And I
Mhm.
was interested in theater and opera production and direction. And they would bring in Pierluigi Pizzi, Luca Ronconi, Franco Zeffirelli, and others. And that's where I met Zeffirelli. And he
Wow.
took me on as an assistant for many of his productions in Italy, not as the only assistant. He had flocks of us, but the
Yeah,
idea was that we would all learn from him. And there was a
sure.
fellow named Carlo who became very good at costumes, and I was more interested in stage movement and how to build a set and where to put the props and scenery on the stage to properly move the story along. And we all learned from him. He was a genius. And he loved being a teacher and he loved having us around. He loved the energy of young people. And so I spent a lot of time with him in Verona and so on. And then moved to Milan and worked at La Scala. And then when I came back to the States and eventually got to the Met, he arrived to do his famous Bohème, December 14th, 1981. And because he knew me from Italy, and although he knew the Met very well, he sort of brought me back into that circle again of people who would be around him. And that was the famous production that still is on today. It's the most seen production in Met opera history. And it starred Teresa Stratas, Jose Carreras, and Renata Scotto, conducted by James Levine.
Mm.
And my arc at the Met was such that I knew that I was planning to leave to return to Europe. And the last production that I worked on, new production, was this Turandot in 1987
It's
with
crazy.
Ava Martone, Franco Zeffirelli directing, James Levine conducting, Placido Domingo as Calaf, Leona
Right.
Mitchell, and later Aprile Milo as Liu. And so the bookends of my career at the Met are Franco Zeffirelli productions of blockbusters that are still
How
around today. And that's where I met Jiang Qing and learned her work and watch how Zeffirelli, I'm going to tell one anecdote from that period that is known by now. It's a massive set. He did it in a genius way. You could criticize certain things, but it's a remarkable achievement and the crowds go wild. But it was tense on the set sometimes, and Ava Martone singing Turandot became angry at the final dress rehearsal and took
mm,
off her headpiece. It had 10,000 beads in it and threw it to the ground. And all of these beads went into the machinery that was so carefully rigged and constructed for the movement of the sets. And more of them went into the orchestra pit, inside drums and violins. It was a disaster 3 days before opening night. And Zeffirelli always traveled with his little tiny ladies with tiny hands, mostly from Florence, who arrived as if by miracle onto the stage and got into the machinery of everything, gathered all the beads and stayed up 72 hours to put together again the headpiece so that Ava Martone, who was profoundly apologetic and gave lovely gifts to these little ladies and apologized to almost everyone, not everyone. And we got the show on an opening night. But the drama of between the final dress and the opening night of making that headpiece again and making sure that some little bee did not gum up the machinery meant that everybody had nessun dorma, nobody sleeps. Everybody had to be up for 72 hours straight, checking all the equipment, every piece of set and every musical instrument to make sure that there was not a random bead that went somewhere. So
that is amazing.
that's part of my memory of that day. And we all were up all the time. And it was, the famous aria that Calaf sings, is Nessun Dorma, let nobody sleep so that
Right.
so we don't find out the name, the secret of what we learn about in Turandot. So there is that, which is why I don't think I met Ai Weiwei in the crowds of thousands we had then, but I certainly knew Chang Ching at that time. And
You
she was
may
very
have you may
inspirational.
have had lunch with him unknowingly at some point, sitting
Yeah,
down with everyone else, right? What a
yeah.
great story that is, Fred. I love that image. There's more drama often behind the scenes,
Oh,
right? In opera than there could ever be on stage. Unimaginable, right? You can't even make it up.
right. So
Beads.
now let's go back to Rome in 2022. And they're trying to get this production of Turandot onto the stage, which, as readers and listeners will understand, it's hard anyway to do an opera production. And if you
Right.
have an artist, great though who he is, who's not, let's say, of the theater, a lot of accommodation has to be made to his vision that it can be translated to practical theatricality so that if there's a musical phrase that lasts 90 seconds and a piece of scenery has to move or a crowd has to move, you can do it in those 90 seconds. That may be something that a visual artist wouldn't know. So it's hard anyway. They're just coming out from a pandemic. Ukraine has been invaded.
Right.
Um, the is his name Maxim or Massimo? It sounds
Max,
like he has a Ukrainian surname because it ends with Enko,
you're
and
right.
that's typically a Ukrainian
You're right.
um,
He is
suffix.
part Ukrainian, and I did never knew that until
Yeah,
recently. Yeah,
and the conductor, if I'm correct, was Oksana Leniv,
that's right. That's right.
Ukrainian,
That's right.
and also she conducts a lot in Bologna, and therefore knows Italy well. I should say to listeners and to you perhaps that in the period when there was a lot of migration out of the so-called Soviet Union and then the independent former nations of the Soviet Union, a lot of them went through Rome, very specifically through Rome. It was a sort of a station where Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Belarusians, all those peoples wound up in Rome before going to their next destination.
Mm.
So there was always a notable community in Rome of people who just got out, let's call it, and were dazzled by Rome's beauty and astonished by the quality of the food and the, let's call it, happy chaos that Rome is compared to the gray regimentation that was the Soviet Union.
Sure.
And there, although brilliant artistry in the Soviet Union, let's never pretend fantastic musical and opera stuff, but it was a bit controlled, and Rome is a lot of anarchic. And so I remember always meeting people from there in Rome and how astonished and dazzled they were by Rome, which must be, I mean, any traveler who arrives in Rome for the first time is astonished. But if they're coming from London, Paris, New York, or LA, it's a different, or Tokyo, it's a different thing than arriving from Minsk,
That's right.
a whole other thing.
Yeah.
So by 2022, they were trying to get this production on, but the world was changing by the minute. We were still, frankly, in a pandemic.
Right.
People were just getting injections. By the way, Italy got COVID. It was the first country in Europe to get it,
That's
second
right.
after China, before the United States. And therefore, Italy in real time in Lombardy, which is to say Bergamo, Brescia, Milan, the Po Valley, the northern part of the Po Valley, was ground zero of COVID in Italy.
Do you
And
know why? Because of the fashion world, because there
yes,
were so many Chinese working in fashion there.
and
That's
because the person who was thought to be, I forget his name, thought to be the person who may have gotten it in China and brought it, he was an Italian, and brought it back to a relatively small town near Brescia, Bergamo, Mantova, that part of eastern Lombardy near the Veneto border. He was thought to have been the first, but yes, there were also many Chinese workers, though most Chinese workers in Italy are in a town called Prato, which is near Florence. And Prato has become the Chinese city of Italy, where they manufacture things in the Italian style. I'm not going to get into the thing of fakes and so on, but Prato is where a lot of them settled. But there was a second large community in Lombardy near the Po River. So um, what happened next as they tried to do that production turned out to Rome?
then, it was even more emotional, even more impactful, the meaning of what Ai Weiwei was bringing to this opera. And very emotional. You can see Oksana, who's this beautiful conductor and lovely. You can see her very emotionally talking about, the war, and here they are doing art, and art will survive, and that she carries a soft baton that is her weapon. Makes me cry a little bit. It's
Mm.
so important that art survives. And so it's very beautiful. And she and Ai Weiwei had this great compassion for life, for immigration, people that are stuck in the war. And Ai Weiwei's art and installations are always a reflection of that. So So for me to be involved in something that's so beautiful and so impactful and important at the same time, our film is full of messages. It doesn't mean to be, but everyone's very philosophical. You take Michael Fabiano, this incredible tenor. Um,
American tenor, yep.
no, he's so intelligent and worldly. No
Yeah.
one, no one talked to him about it. We just, gave him, we just let him run with this, and everything he says is pithy and important and right on about life, about war, about art, about the lack of art. If there were no music in the world, what would happen to us? Really, a lot of questions are raised.
Michael, and I hope I'm remembering the name of it correctly, I believe it's called Art Smart. Art Smart is a
Ah,
foundation that he's created that promotes arts education. And in addition to his very active career as one of the world's leading tenors, he also devotes his time to Art Smart.
oh, I didn't know.
And oh, yeah. So therefore, this is something he cares very deeply about. He's very eloquent.
Yes.
I teach a course at NYU, and he was one of my first people to come a long time ago. I have singers and directors and conductors come, and we co-teach. Michael came very early, and it just struck me that his eloquence was off the
Ah,
charts. Singers are
exactly.
very smart people. Let's not get the wrong impression. They really are. You have to be. But even among them, he had a
I hope
depth
the
of
book is
and
recorded
subtle.
for the two of you together. I can just imagine it must have been incredible. Those lucky students who
It's
had both.
findable. We film it all, so it's on YouTube and on Vimeo, and people can find it.
For it.
Adventures in Italian Opera, Fred Plotkin, Michael Fabiano would
Oh,
be the
great. I'll look for that.
yeah.
Thank you.
Um, but anyway, the I'll tell you where I come from with the opera Turandot, which is why I was just a little questioning about this undertaking. Is that to me, the two leading characters, who are the Ice Princess Turandot, who's Chinese, and the Ignoto, in other words, the unknown, because they don't say his name, because that's the whole story of the opera, is that if she learns his name, then he could be put to death. And so he is a prince from somewhere in Central Asia, and they're both anti-heroes to me. They're both selfish. They both want what they want, and thousands of people can die in the process. Um, the one that we all care about is Liu, the slave girl, who is the only one who knows his name apart from his blind father. Um, and the blind father is abused, and Liu takes care of him. Liu, rather than tell his name, prefers to die, and Piuttosto morire, I'd rather die. And Turandot is taken aback by this gesture. That, what is it that makes you do that? And Liu says, "E l'amore," it's love that makes
Hmm.
you do that. And so, therefore, to me, the only sympathetic character in the opera is the woman who would rather die than let
Hmm.
the man that she distantly loves not
Yes.
go on to his dream of marrying this icy princess. We should also say that Puccini died before completing the composition of the opera. We have the notes for the last, 10 minutes or so, and they were completed by Franco Alfano, and Toscanini was involved in that. And therefore, people will always debate, is the music of the last 10 minutes, which comes after the death of Liu, um, because when it was premiered at La Scala, Toscanini conducted, and at the moment where Liu dies, Toscanini put down his baton, and I hope I'm recalling the Italian correctly. E qui posò il maestro. Here, posò la mano il maestro. In other words, this is where the maestro Puccini put his hand down.
Oh, it's
And
beautiful.
so that from that point forward, the last 10 minutes are condemned by musicologists, rightly or wrongly. But
Right.
I suppose that my feeling about Turandot's music is magnificent. From a production point of view, it's one of the ultimate challenges. Um, but I don't like the two leading characters. They're not good people. And normally, when you have an opera, at least one person, it's Aida, it's Violetta, whoever, is sympathetic.
Right.
And these are not sympathetic people.
Kind of fits in today's film world as well, though, Fred. You have to admit, it's more common these days not to like any of the characters on TV
Really?
or sometimes.
Tell me about that because I hadn't thought about that. I go to a
Yeah,
lot of films, but all right,
I mean,
give me
I
a
think
couple of
Succession,
current examples, if you would, of films where that's the case.
yeah, Succession, I think, is one of those.
Ah,
I don't watch it. My husband does, but a lot of people talk about it. And there's just a lot of films these days too, where you're there, you understand what's going on, even Substance today, right?
which
Um,
I have not seen with
right.
Demi Moore. Yeah,
Hard to like anybody these days. It's just this is what's going on in the world today.
yeah,
It's I don't know. I think it's kind of appropriate in a way that we have it out there right now.
could be, could be. Um,
And do you
and
think
so
that past
yes.
10 minutes or the last part of Turandot, it kind of to me opens up for a modern interpretation? I mean, in a way, you could really interpret it in as many conductors or opera celebrities, sopranos do, just interpret it in their own way. It's kind of an interesting thing. There are no other operas like that, really, right?
Well, the Tales of Hoffmann was another opera that was not completed completed by the composer. There are a few out there, but this is the most famous example, in
Sure,
part
sure.
because Pasqualini put his imprint on that by saying this is where the maestro laid down his hand, but
Right.
also because it's more recent, and
Right.
also because the music is so glorious, and also because um, it's a story of two people who do find themselves together. You could say that Kalaf, which is the name of the unknown guy, um,
Right.
has conquered, he's gotten his way. You could say that Turandot, who, to use common parlance, has issues because women in her past, in other words, ancestors from thousands of years before, were done wrong by men. And
Right.
therefore, Turandot will not yield to a man. And she has three riddles that she asks. And if you can't answer the three riddles, you're beheaded. And in the Met Zeffirelli production, there are 36 heads on the stage on poles, so we
Right.
know we could see the carnage that she has wrought. But
Mm.
um, Kalaf comes along, or the unknown comes along, and they ultimately, after the death of Liu, Turandot comes to understand this is what love is, and she then gets a big kiss that she's never been kissed before to great music, and then suddenly, so il tuo nome, I know your name. Your name is El Amor, it's love. And then everybody rejoices, and the people are still oppressed, and somehow I mean, to me, a big part of that opera is the oppression of the common people and
Mm.
the misery in which they live, and the contrast between these two wealthy, powerful people, one of whom has passed a test. But I think the people are relieved too because they're tired. Basta sangue, as her father says. Enough blood, basta sangue.
Right.
We want peace. We want to live together, and that's great, unless you're Liu or Kalaf's father, who didn't have a good fate. And I never like how Kalaf sort of lets his father suffer no matter what, just to get his own way. That's not flattering. That's not a good son. And but nonetheless, nobody's perfect. These two characters are not perfect. But I always think that the music is so glorious that sometimes people are losing track of the issues here.
Hmm.
The issues are war, hatred, cruelty, tolerance of blood, tolerance of violence, the oppression of millions and billions of people
Right.
that in this particular case is ancient China, but it could be Ukraine, it could be all of Africa, it could be many parts of our country, the United States right now, people who are being excluded by a couple of gold diggers who who basically are marginalizing millions and millions of Americans, and by connection, people all around the world. And so, yes, when people say is opera relevant, absolutely it's relevant. Um, how did how is it received in Rome, this production?
It was incredible reviews, actually, beautiful reviews. It's such a stunning opera that I can't even imagine. Rai actually has it showing it on TV right now, Rai TV.
Hmm.
And it's stunning to look at with the production design and with Oksana and Michael Fabiano and the other cast members. It was just stunning. It was received really well.
Hmm. So before we get to Verdi, because this particular topic, this is where you and I met a long time ago over this topic. Um, Nothing is more dear to me than the subject of your Verdi film. I want to ask you about being a film producer and about the challenges of creating films that are intended as art rather than intended to be part of a big money making machine,
Right.
and how you take your films around. I know you were just at the Santa Barbara Film Festival, and I'm reminding people we're recording on February 21st of 2025. Um, and talk about that. I know that you both films had a big success there. How does it work? How do you get a film noticed that's not Wicked or not, Oppenheimer or Barbie?
Well, I don't know where to start with this because I've always been obsessed with film since I was little. I would beg anyone to take me to the movies and I'd make them stay twice to see it again. I was just loved being immersed in those worlds, those imaginative worlds of color and sound. And so I think that's part of it. I also was brought up with opera. How lucky was I that my grandmother, when she was making her sauce on Saturday, Sunday, would have these Mario Lanza red vinyl albums. And I probably didn't even know how important it was. I wasn't educated about opera as a young person, but it was just always around. It was always there. We would talk a little bit about it, but so I was lucky to have that as a background. So when I guess I just gravitated in towards film, and I in Boston, I was hired by Universal Pictures to come on board and be their Northeast field rep. So I was educated in film by being at the studios. I was a studio system. I was an executive at Universal Disney and Orion, ended up as the president of Orion Pictures with Dances with Wolves and Silence of the Lambs many years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I was educated at the foot of masters, really. I would travel with directors, producers who were my favorite always, and learned so much. And I could never get enough. It's what I loved. It's what I wanted to talk about. It's what I wanted to do, to see. You have to watch a film when you're at the studios hundreds of times, and it was never enough for me. I wanted more. I wanted the nuance of seeing something and perfecting it fit my personality also. I just loved it. So that's kind of how it started. And then I just segued into producing theater and television and then film. I
Mm-hmm.
did a short that was Dandelion Dharma that was at the Palm Springs Film Festival and won an audience award there. And then I moved on to this. And to combine the things that I love the most, music and opera, with this medium of film is just the most glorious thing you can imagine. I feel very blessed every day. I mean, listening to Verdi for 10 years
Wow.
that, you know, even my husband is so happy I'm involved in the world of opera and film because he benefits also from hearing it. So that's beautiful. So I guess that's part of it. And being
But
able
to
to,
get a film noticed, um, obviously, I know the quality of these two films, and I'm not the only one. But how, for example, does it wind up being in the Santa Barbara Film Festival? Do you have to know people? How does a festival pick the
well,
films that you pick?
it's very interesting, Fred. It always helps to know people.
Hmm.
And I'm old, so I know I know a lot of people have been around for a long time, decades of
Only in Hollywood are you old.
the mind is young. But so I've been, since the 70s, I've been working in film. I know a lot of people. And so sometimes I don't even know that they're at the festival. So I submitted both my films kind of late to Santa Barbara. And the next day I get a call from Claudia Puig, who was the USA Today film critic and now
Mhm.
is the programmer. So I used to work with Claudia all the time. I really didn't remember that she was there. And so she calls me up and she goes, Christine, I love seeing your name all over these films, and they are glorious. I love them. So let's talk. And I said, yes, fantastic. So Viva Verdi had already had its world premiere in Woodstock in October 2024, and they like to do world premieres at Santa Barbara. But she said, I love this movie so much. It's so special. Let's do it. It'll be your West Coast premiere. And then with Ai Weiwei, she said, it's glorious. And I'm also curating a few other festivals. I want both these films. So that was our world premiere. And the film was just done. I said to Maxime, we're delivering wet prints. And he said, what does that mean? I said, yeah, we used to print on film and they used to be wet before they were just drying when you delivered them. So it was just done. We just slid in. I'm not kidding, because you have to get archival and you take the prints off, the stamp off the archival. So that was our last thing. So we were lucky to be slid in, and Maxime came to Santa Barbara, and just beloved it. The first screening was packed, but that's our audience. It's a really sophisticated audience that loves film and loves the arts, loves opera, classical music. So they came and they just could not ask him enough. We were both up there doing a Q&A, enough questions. Where did this start? How did it start? What is your background? When's your next film? Is it more opera? And then when I would say, because Maxime was the cameraman on Viva Verdi, I said, our film is also showing next week, Viva Verdi. So we have Puccini and Verdi here at the Santa Barbara. And Maria, Angelina Jolie, was also honored that week that we were
About Maria Callas, yeah.
yeah, our world premiere. So that was really great. So it was very exciting. It was really a little bit of an opera-centric
But
festival.
also, we must add that in Santa Barbara is one of the most important music conservatories in the United States, the Music Academy of the West, which was founded, I believe it was founded by Lotte Lehmann, one of the great old German singers.
Ah,
Marilyn Horn studied there early. Grace Bunbury studied there early. Marilyn became very involved in education there. She's lived in Santa Barbara. The great American chef, and not only Julia Child, lived in Santa Barbara for a long time. And
mm,
I believe Oprah Winfrey lives in Santa Barbara. So it's not a typical town. But
no,
from the point of view of music, having the Music Academy of the West, one of the great music schools in our country, in that town, meant that you had a built-in audience for Puccini and Verdi.
right.
And I'm sure that helped. The films are great on their own, but that helped to have an
Absolutely.
audience that really knew the subject matter of Puccini and Verdi.
That's right. And I have friends there, very sophisticated, high-end friends who said, we love that this is coming here. Let us know the dates. And they brought friends. And this word of mouth really spread quickly. And our next screening was even more packed than the first one. And for both films, for Viva Verdi, we had to turn away ticket holders. And I saw two men actually fighting over the last seat. I said, guys, come on, we're going to have another screening. And it was such a great thing to see in a way. And so they put encore screenings on the last Saturday for both films. That is such a positive thing for us as filmmakers, that we're hitting, an untapped audience, an underserved audience, actually. And people came up afterwards and said, we are hungry for movies like this. We want movies like this. They're intelligent, they're sophisticated, they have a message. The music's off the chart beautiful, and it has heart, soul. We cried, we laughed, all those things. It entertains, it enlightens, and it's impactful. It's such a, that's what I think film should be.
So to remind people, we're speaking on February 21. This is being broadcast March 28th. What are you doing next? In other words, between February 21 and the end of March of 2025, where would these films be going?
Thank you for asking, Fred, because we have a full schedule. So March 13th, 14th, and 15th, Boulder Film Festival has Viva Verdi. And
Boulder,
because
Colorado. Okay.
right. Because they heard about the reaction of Santa Barbara, it's a very word of mouth spreads very quickly. And they added a third screening on the 15th because
Hmm.
it's going to be one of those films that an audience pleaser, right? And then Ai Weiwei's Turn Dot on March 21st, we'll have a huge premiere. It's our international premiere at CPH, which is it's the most important documentary festival in Copenhagen, in the world, actually. It's in Copenhagen, but it's the biggest and the best. And Ai Weiwei has a film called Animality. It's a documentary that hasn't been seen, his documentary about animals and people. And that night, we'll show Ai Weiwei's Turn Dot. He and Maxime will speak. There'll be a Q&A, and then they'll show Animality, which is a producer's dream, right?
Yeah.
To have both these films the same night at the most important documentary festival in the world. I'm so excited about it. And Julian Lennon is our executive producer on board, and Andy
Hmm.
Cohen. They will both be there along with Ai Weiwei, Maxime, my partner, Marta Zaccarone. And we haven't all been together in the same place yet. So we're all
Hmm.
looking forward to it. It's going to be very exciting. And then we go on to a lot of other, I can't mention them because they haven't been announced yet.
Well,
And
okay.
an announcement date coming up, but
So in other words, what might be called the festival circuit, where people take an interest either from a musical point of view, an Italian point of view. Um, do you happen to know, and I'm pitching this to you in real time, when it's New York appearances will start?
I don't
Okay.
right now, but I
All right.
know
We'll talk.
that's right for sure, Fred. You will absolutely be a guest of honor there, and hopefully do
No,
a
not
Q&A.
only for that reason, but because I know a lot of people who would be
Yes, of
very
course.
interested. That's
I
why.
know you do.
Yeah.
So, but I can tell you that we'll be in Toronto because it will be announced before this airs, and that will
Okay.
be in April at Hot Docs, which is the second most important documentary festival in the world.
Hmm.
Excited about that for Ai Weiwei's Turn Dot.
Okay. And I know plenty of people. You should know, by the way, about Toronto, that Toronto has a huge Italian community, but very specifically from Friuli, Venezia, Giulia, the northeast of Italy.
Mm.
And um, so much so that you can walk down the streets in Toronto and hear people speaking in Friulano, not in Italian. The
Oh,
reason they went there is because Ontario has a lot of lumber, and Friuli was the part of Italy where a lot of wood furniture was made, but also musical instruments made
yeah.
from the local wood. So there were a lot of people who knew how to work with wood. So when immigration started, they all went to Ontario because of the wood. And that's why there's a very large presence of Friulani compared to most Italians.
That's so
Um,
interesting. I grew up in Buffalo and would go to Toronto and
right.
Ontario all the
Yep.
time. So Toronto's kind of a little bit like my second home. And my husband's Canadian and
Hmm.
was brought up in Toronto. So it's very, very close to my heart, Toronto.
Very good. So let's now go to the film that's called Viva Verdi. Um, I'll say a little bit about it. Um, One of the places I love most in the world. Remember, I worked at La Scala. I know Milan very well. I went to college there. Um, is the Casa di Riposo per Musicisti, built by Giuseppe Verdi, um, using the royalties from most of his operas, not all. And he decided that the reason that he became rich and successful and famous and so on was because of the work of musicians who worked anonymously or quietly in the orchestra pits or in the chorus, the people who made everything happen, whether at La Scala La Fenice, Paris, wherever he worked, especially Parma and especially Genoa. We should say about Verdi, and I always juxtapose Verdi and Wagner, both born in 1813. Wagner built monuments to himself, like the Festspielhaus in Bayreuth. Great theater, great festival, no complaints.
Right.
Verdi built monuments to other people.
That's
And in the
right.
1850s, when he had some success by then with Rigoletto and Traviata and Trovatore, he built a hospital in the Po Valley
That's
for
right.
agricultural workers because Italy at that time was not Italy. It was occupied by Austria, occupied by France, and so on. And the people who were the poor people, the farm workers, if they needed medical care, they couldn't get it. And therefore they would die, or they would die from injuries, let's say, of gangrene, of bleeding to death. And so Verdi built a hospital in the middle of the agricultural part of the Po Valley, and he brought in doctors from Bologna and specialists from Milan, and the quality of medical care in this hospital that he entirely paid for, and people got free medical care in the 1850s because of Verdi, was in a way the template for what he later built in Milan. His wife, Giuseppina Straponi, was dying or had died. He had a partnership, let's call it, with Teresa Stoltz, who was a great soprano. We don't know if they were romantically involved or not, it doesn't matter. But Stoltz helped him realize this project of a building that he designed that would be a rest home for musicians who, in some way, had lived a decent life but didn't make a lot of money. And when Verdi died on January 27th, 1901, he specifically said that he did not want the place to open during his lifetime.
That's
And
right.
Stoltz, and he was buried next to Straponi in the Cimitero Monumentale, the monumental cemetery, the great cemetery of Milan, where Toscanini and Vladimir Horowitz are and many other people. And Teresa Stoltz was the one who took over the project. And it opened on October 10th, Verdi's birthday of 1902. And
Right.
Stoltz arranged for Straponi and Verdi their remains to be transported to this place. And part of the beautiful thing there is that Verdi's right there with the
Yeah,
people.
I
Um,
know.
D'Annunzio wrote the famous line, Pianse e amò per tutti. He wept and he loved for everyone.
Mm,
And when I've worked there, I've volunteered there and so on. And when I talk to residents and they'll go and they thank him, they thank Verdi. They stop by every so often as they're going to a rehearsal to have lunch, whatever they're doing. They stop and they talk to him. And it's
mm,
the most beautiful thing because more than 100 years later, 123 years later, this place is thriving.
that's
It is
right.
a place of extraordinary beauty and it's very life affirming. And that's where I want you to come in now and talk about the
Okay.
way this place is so life affirming and so
Uh,
deeply moving to anyone who has a brain and a heart.
I am so crazy about Verdi. You've no idea. I really feel like I know so intimately because I've spent
A
so much
hero.
at Casa Verdi and with his music and studying him. Fred, you and I were kindred spirits on so many levels, but that's the number one for me. He's incredible. I'm going to try to get him canonized because we're going to meet with the Anyway, I am serious. I think he has saved so many lives and he's brought such beauty to the world like no one else. And Fred, I want to talk about Verdi's Ah. It's very important to
Yes,
me.
please.
Okay. But let me start with how this came about and how spending time at this home is just remarkable. Everyone should have this experience. Everyone should be able to go there. And when Yvonne and I did this, a couple of things that we said right away that every frame of the film will be beautiful. To meet Verdi's image of what this world should be, his Casa Verdi, because he spared no expense at all. Everything is stunning. It's beautiful. You're there. The wood is still beautiful. Everything You just want to be there. And the music, it's like sonic colors is the way we had described it. The music comes out of every door, and there's young people, there's older people, there's an energy, there's these young children that come in first grade that come around and get a little lesson of music, or they meet with the residents and go around and hug and kiss them. It's just the sweetest thing. And every day, Ferdinando Dani, who's a director of activities, he has all these great activities lined up every day. So there's music therapy, maybe 2 or 3 times a week, which helps them to for their memory to come back, and to have these songs that they think that they remember, but all of a sudden they're singing them by heart because it
Yeah.
comes up so easily. And um, and there's concerts, there's competitions with young students that are in different schools. It's just beautiful. You want to be there. I didn't want to leave. And even the students that were there were 18 young students that were there with the 80 residents who lived there when we started filming. And the students, I asked Francesco Brown, who's from London, and I said, Francesco, how long have you been here? 3 years. I said, how long are you staying? He said, I would stay here forever if I could, because there's such light and energy. And they say a lot of these students know you can't read, you can't get this knowledge from books. It's not accessible. You can only get it here. It's where they teach it, where they give it to you with love and with passion. And they share this obsession with you of music. How wonderful is that? So these young kids are as kindred spirits with this older generation. It's such a beautiful thing to see, this exchange, this intergenerational exchange.
I want to give a little background for listeners and perhaps for you. Um, I first went there in the 1970s when I was a teenager
Mm,
and living in Bologna, and then was taken there to Milan. My first visit to La Scala was 1975, and for an Aida. And I was told that I really wanted to visit the Casa di Riposo per Musicisti.
mm,
And at that time, it was not particularly open. It was a
mhm.
distinguished residence. They were called illustri ospiti, in other words, illustrious guests. These are all guests
Right. Guess
of Verdi. And at that time, it was not open to the public the way it is now. I mean, it was very different because it was a bit enclosed, and you had a lot of people living in their memories, and saying to me, for example, I sang
mm,
Violetta in 1936 in Rovigo, and
mm,
she would talk about that, and she would have a willing listener in me. And I say Rovigo, which is a little opera house where a lot of people start, because it was the fascist era, and therefore 1936 was the year that Toscanini was beaten up by fascists in Bologna, and it was all very freighted with that. And they would talk about the war, la guerra, la miseria, in other words, hunger. And they went through so many of the experiences that Verdi in his operas actually described. So when I
mm,
went there as a teenager and in my 20s when I lived in Milan, I would hear these stories and collected these stories in me about
mm.
hardship. And through the years, the place has changed with the times, with better medical care. Italy did not always have the best medical care. Now it has outstanding medical care, more accessible than our country has. And therefore, things have changed. People live better lives. And one of the things that had to be acknowledged was that people live longer now and live with cognitive issues. Music, we know very well, we don't have to explore it here at length, keeps the mind alive. And
That's
there's a
right.
part of the brain that's activated by music, and therefore, a lot of the people there are very vibrant and very active and engaged in teaching and performing in their 90s. But
Right.
there is now a wing there for people with dementia, Alzheimer's, and so on. And I knew very well a lady who was a resident there. She was the mother of a friend of mine. And we would go visit her and
Hmm.
talk to her, and she didn't always remember everything. And I would then go visit other people in that wing because they were separated from the main activities of the
Right.
casa. And there was one lady who'd been in the chorus in Verona. And because I knew Verona, having worked there, I would
Mm-hmm.
talk to her about Verona, and she was not
Mm.
all that with it. But at a certain point, she said, "Would you like me to sing for you?" I said,
Mm-hmm.
"Please." And I thought that she would sing something by Verdi, but she sang Vici d'arte from Puccini's Tosca. And she,
Uh-huh.
great voice for 82. She knew
Mm.
every word. She
Yeah.
was almost always completely in tune, um, sang with
Uh-huh.
great emotion. And after she finished, I thanked her. And she said, "For what?" Because she'd forgotten she'd just sung for me. So, among the many things that I am so impressed with there is the degree to which they've adapted to modern times and illness and medical knowledge that we didn't have 30, 40, and 50 years ago. And with such compassion and such
Mm.
beauty, because caregiving to people with dementia and cognitive issues is really hard. And to see them do that so beautifully, I think Verdi would have admired that as well. And it fulfilled his concept, his mission, even though he probably did not envision that as part of the original plan for the Casa di Riposo. Now, in the years, they decided that it would be a good idea to rejuvenate the place by bringing in the word rejuvenate to make young again, younger musicians
Right.
who were often from economic disadvantages, who might have been from Latin America or Asia or Africa or
Right.
parts of Europe. And they would be, in effect, assigned to a particular illustrious guest. And so that if the illustrious guest played the piano, they would bring in someone who was interested in the piano. And the older person would impart everything she knew to the younger person, who would then perhaps take that person out on the town and take her to a museum or take her to the opera or a concert in ways that she could not have gone out on her own because of the difficulty of getting around a big city like Milan. And so both benefited, and the relationships that were formed and the musical. I mean, the way I went and learned from people who had sung in the 1920s and 30s, that culture is being passed down to people today. And
Absolutely.
it's
Passing the
wonderful
torch.
too that they bring little kids,
Yeah.
so they can see not, they can see that, and this is something addressed in your film, I know. In Italy, people who are above 65, who are seniors, whatever word we want to use, it's called la terza età, the third age. In other
Uh-huh.
words, you have your childhood and development and young adulthood, and then you have your prime of life, whatever you want to call that. And then there's the third age. And
Right.
in your film, it's indicated that the third age could be the best one.
That's right. That's our tagline because
Yeah,
we saw that. It's very evident and very obvious there that there's kindred spirits creating passionately, teaching. It doesn't stop. The activities don't stop there. There's decoupage. There's all kinds of things going on all the time. Or you could just go to your room and be quiet and
yeah.
write your poetry or write more music, whatever,
Or
whatever.
paint.
That's right. There's
Yeah,
painting.
yeah,
Right. Yeah, passing that torch though to the next generation is something that America has to get a little bit better at, I think. And Yvonne and I always thought that this could be a blueprint for retirement homes all over the world. The Motion Picture Home in Los Angeles is another beautiful home for the film industry. And there are young people there, but they don't live there. They're not as incorporated. This intergenerational exchange is not as incorporated as it is in Milan at Casa Verde.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a very
Well,
special.
because Verdi, in effect, created the blueprint and also something that's irreplaceable. He's there.
Yes,
He
he
is
is.
there.
Yes.
And Teresa Stoltz, it was a stroke of brilliance that she moved him there and with Straponi, rather than leave them in the great cemetery of Milan with all the other great figures there.
Right.
Um,
One of his wishes, though, was to be where there's music all the time.
yeah,
You know, when I'm in churches in Europe, I often think about the knights that are buried in there's priests and bishops that are buried in the churches, and I say, how wonderful it must be also there to have the music from the mass and from the masses that are said. It's always interesting to me, but I love that he's there. It's a very sacred little place there. The whole place is
In
sacred.
Vienna, the central cemetery, the Zentralfriedhof, they have a musician section.
Oh,
And you have not Mozart, because we don't know where he is officially, but you have most of the great Viennese and Austrian and Austro-Hungarian composers. You have a lot of opera singers, you have conductors and so on. And they're all together except for Gustav Mahler and his
huh,
wife Alma, who are
huh.
up in the 20th district, which is near the wine producing area of Vienna. But I don't know why. I'm gonna have to find out why Mahler never got to be in the main cemetery of Vienna. They're sure
I
there's
love that idea. It makes me think that there's a great film there of all those great minds coming to life again and doing something, having conversations about life, about the world, about music. My
one of
imagination.
my very favorite opera singers because she was great, but also because I had such a wonderful working relationship with her. I really loved her. Was Viennese soprano Leonie Rieseneck.
Uh-huh.
And when I go to Vienna, I don't visit graves, but I tend to get a bunch of flowers and visit her grave. I will
Um,
look at, Johann Strauss Jr. and a lot of the other people there, and Schubert, of course, but I will stop and visit her because
hmm,
I knew her very well and because she, more than any opera singer I can think of, there were people with better voices, certainly, and who had more control as singers. Leontine Price, you name them, there were so many. Joan
hmm,
Sutherland, Birgit Nielsen, but there was something about Leonie Rieseneck's character and soul that she could take any character in Verdi and Strauss and Wagner and make you care more about that character than any other singer I ever worked with or saw. And
hmm.
she would drive audiences wild. And I think it's wonderful that you can go and visit. When you're in Copenhagen, there's a cemetery that has a few of the great Danish musicians. And I'm suddenly blocking his name because I haven't been thinking about him. There was a great heroic tenor, the great Lauritz Melchior, the great Danish tenor of the 1930s and 40s and 50s. And the last time I was in Copenhagen, I went to visit his grave to find that it was in disrepair. He didn't have heirs that I know of. And therefore, his name was, the letters were coming off and so on. And there was a lot of crabgrass around his tomb. So I went and
Mhm.
spoke to people in the opera in Denmark. And I said, maybe you want to do something to spruce it up a bit. He was one of the greatest Wagnerian tenors of all time.
Yeah.
And
And they
you
did.
know, yeah, apparently, yeah,
I love
because
cemeteries too. I love this story. It's
yeah,
wonderful. Thank you.
yeah, no, but definitely, Toscanini is buried in the Cimitero Monumentale, and his daughter, one of his daughters, married Vladimir Horowitz. So, like a good son-in-law, Horowitz wants to be buried with his Italian family, so that's why he's there and not New York where he lived.
I see.
Um,
Yeah.
Cemeteries tell stories. They tell, I mean, we have in New York many, but we have one called Greenwood, which is not Greenwood, it's Greenwood. Leonard
Hmm.
Bernstein is buried there. There's another cemetery in the Bronx where Duke Ellington is buried, and a lot of jazz musicians. Then upstate, we have Valhalla, which is a big cemetery named for the Wagnerian, where the
Mm.
gods go, so to speak. And there are
Mm.
many musicians up there as well.
Mm. I
Um,
love the
yes,
cemetery in Nice. That's my favorite
it
cemetery.
is. It is. My favorite is in Genoa. If
Uh-huh.
you like the one in Nice, you will like the one in Genoa.
I haven't been
The
to Genoa.
Genoa is full.
Put it on my
You've never
list.
been to Genoa.
Not
All right.
yet.
So I know it intimately. I had a home near Genoa for many, many years, and I wrote a book about it. Wagner said that after seeing Genoa, for him, London and Paris were boring.
Oh.
Genoa is so vibrant and distinct. It really is. It's like nothing else. And
Mm.
Verdi. loved Genova. It was his
Mm,
favorite city
I did not
because
know that.
Verdi lived in the cold agricultural areas of the Po Valley that we'll get to. He lived a lot of time in Milan. He lived in Paris a lot, but he liked what he called Genoa's Republican spirit. By Republican, I don't mean modern American politics, but to be an independent, free-thinking republic,
Mm,
like the Republic of Venice.
hmm
His opera Simone Boccanegra is set in the Republic of Genova, and he would go every winter. It was for a New Yorker, it would be like his West Palm Beach, that he would
hmm
go every winter to Geneva and winter there because the weather was mild, and lived in a beautiful apartment in a palace, and would visit the Teatro Carlo Felice and see his operas produced there. And after Falstaff, his last opera, premiered at La Scala, it was then brought to Genova, and he supervised the production. He loved being there. He loved the Genoese and their particularity. They're not everybody's favorite people in Italy. I love them, but
mm.
there's a bakery there that's still there called Klein Guti, and it was a Swiss baker who moved to Genoa, and he created a cake called the Falstaff cake that you can
Ah,
still have, and it was to honor the production of Falstaff at the Teatro Carlo Felice. And above the cash register is a handwritten note from Verdi saying to Signor Planguti, "Complimenti for your delicious cake. Your
oh,
Falstaff is even better than mine."
how beautiful is that?
So Verdi spent 40 winters in Genoa.
He was such a generous soul, wasn't he? In every way, in his music, in his, his philanthropy with the hospital, with Casa Verde, with everything.
Yeah.
He embraced people, as you said.
And he helped lead the battle for Italian unification
That's
and
right.
throwing out foreign occupiers. What was Wagner doing? He
That's
was
right.
living on the lam and sleeping with women to get the money from their husbands to pay for his own projects. But Verdi was earning money and
Right.
giving it away to people who could use it and benefit from it. Now, I know that you have worked on a film that I've not seen and know nothing about, but I was drawn to the title, Figli del Fiume, Children of the River, very
Right.
specifically the Po River. What is this about? I don't know this film at all, so, but I know the
Well,
Po River, so I want to ask you.
as I mentioned, Federico Rodelli, who also worked on Viva Verdi, this is his film. And he's been working for Fremantle as a freelancer, and this is one of his first
Is
feature films.
Fremantle a film production company?
Fremantle, that's right.
Yeah,
Out of
I
it.
think I saw the film recently, Challengers, and they were one of the credits. Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
they're good. They're a good company. So this is slow cinema, Fred. This
Hmm.
is one of those Italian, very poetic. And what I'm struck by all the time is that young Italian men, women, I guess I take for granted that they're educated or into poetry or into philosophy, but these young Italian men that I know, these filmmakers like Federico, like Maxime, they can sing arias, they can quote philosophers, they are so well read, and it shows in their art. It's their Maxime's first feature film is this I was turned up. It's hard to believe. And so Federico is from Parma and has an obsession with the Po River, like you do, Fred.
Yeah.
So wonderful that he went and he follows three men that are in search of ancestral waters and ancestral roots. They live along the Po River. One is an ex-priest. One is a recovering alcoholic, and the other just lives there. And they have different ways of relating to nature and to the river. For one, it's the mother of
Hmm.
all people. For another, it's waiting. It's the future of what's coming to him, and so it's very philosophical. It's beautifully shot. It's very meditative. It's stunning. And I can't wait for you to see it. It's in post production. It will finish this year, and we'll start getting into to festivals. I'm an executive producer right now, but we're talking about my company coming on board as a co-producer as well. and it helps with taxes and other things. So we're in
Mhm.
the midst of that, but it's
So
really
I'm going to
beautiful.
talk a bit about the Po River for people who don't know it. Um, we think of the great rivers of the world, the Ganges, the Yangtze, the Nile, the Amazon, the Mississippi, and others, as being these defining waterways that cut through continents and are
Mm,
surrounded by people and give life. I mean, the Nile, if you go to the Nile, you discover that it
yeah.
gave life to the people who lived near there. The Mississippi in a very different way. The Mississippi has smaller rivers like the Snake and the Missouri that feed into the Mississippi, and it all comes out into what I call the Gulf of Mexico and where Louisiana is. And so, therefore, it's this great arrival in New Orleans from Minnesota, and it cuts through the North American continent of the United States. The Amazon is more horizontal, cuts through much of South America, touching many countries, primarily Brazil. The Nile goes, there's the upper Nile, it goes into the Mediterranean. The Yangtze goes into, I believe, the South China Sea or the China Sea. Um, these are massive rivers. The Po is not a massive river. The Po, you've crossed it before you know it. But it begins around Torino, Turin, and it flows from the northwest of Italy through the lands that are among the most agriculturally fertile in all of Italy. And north of in Lombardy is Cremona, the province of Cremona, and Mantova, Mantua. South is the province of Parma and Piacenza, and it separates Emilia Romagna, which was more French in its occupation, from
Mm,
Lombardy, which is more Austrian occupied, but have great histories of their own, and into the Veneto and into the Venetian lagoon. And it becomes sort of this dispersed place at the Venetian lagoon with waterways and eels and frogs and all kinds of things, and people who live on the lagoon and bird life. There's a special orange duck that only lives there. It's a fascinating microcosm that ends south of Venice, near Chioggia, which is a major fishing port. So it is the defining river of northern Italy. It is a river that um, produces incredible fogs. And so, therefore, the atmosphere, unlike a lot of these other big rivers I mentioned, is often very moist, very moody, very reflective at certain times of the year, especially on the southern side of the river, but also the northern side. You can walk and stick your hand in front of you and not see your hand because it's that foggy. And Fellini captured, he was not from that area, he was a little further south, the sense of the fogs and how
mm,
wandering around, how the fog, the moisture created the particular conditions to make Parmigiano Reggiano, to make prosciutto di Parma, to make all kinds of food products are a
right,
result of the moisture from the river. The river
right.
has storione, sturgeon. It's the only place really around that area that has a lot of sturgeon and therefore caviar. Um, you can see on the northern side where all the rice plantations are. Risotto is the primary grain of that rice and risotto more than wheat. Wheat is more the southern side, um, more than other grains. Uh, as you get further northeast, you have more corn planted. And as you go from one town to the next along the river, these tiny villages, you discover that each one has its own food that's drawn from the river or drawn from the environment that the river creates. Um,
Mm,
it literally historically separated um, two different realities, and culturally and politically. And Verdi, who lived on the south side and built his hospital just south of the Po by a couple of miles, but transferred to the northern side to get to Milan, was conversant in that river very well. And when I teach people about Verdi, yes, we know about his operas, about Milan, about Paris and Genoa, and so on, but they really don't know his boyhood. And his boyhood was right there. He grew up
hmm
about 5 kilometers from the river and in a town called Roncole. and his parents were farmers, and his mother ran a sort of trattoria. And the house where he was born, I don't know if you've been there, um,
There.
they had a stable below, and the people who would travel from Milan to Bologna along this road would stop there because the father grew the food. The mother was a renowned cook, and Verdi and his sister lived there. And Verdi lived completely out in the country and had no formal education originally, but he got his education from the people who came from
Right.
Milan, Bologna, Milan, great commercial capital, Bologna, great intellectual capital, and would bring him books and bring
Right.
him things. And he learned Shakespeare and he learned the Greek poets and he learned all of that from the books that were brought by the mail carriers. This was the postal road. And near where they lived was the place where you could easily cross the Po River. And
Hmm.
so culatello was his favorite meat. And culatello is sort of the backside of the pig. And it
Hmm.
would hang in cellars below water level at the Po River. And it was not air dried like prosciutto, but it was moisture cured. And
Right.
his most natural environment. He became a farmer at a certain point when after Aida, he sort of stopped composing for a while and ran his farm. And he developed plant lives. He became very sophisticated about grapes, about farming, about cheese making, and so on. All of this on a farm that was very close to the Po River. And
Hmm.
the cuisine that he loved the most because he had pigs and he would slaughter the pigs and the spalla, the pork shoulder. If he was trying to persuade a diva to sing his opera or an impresario to see things his way, he would handwrite his recipe for spalla di San Secondo, pork shoulder, and send a pork shoulder with his handwritten recipe. All of that came from the Po River. And
Amazing.
so it's so much a part of the Italy that I love that most people don't know particularly well. The northern part near Pavia, there are frogs that grow there in the tributaries. And the reason for that is historically, mosquitoes would come to the rice paddies around Pavia and Lomelina, and the frogs would eat the mosquitoes, protecting the rice workers from being bitten all the time. This was
Right.
nature. And then later in the year, you would have frog risotto in Pavia. And
Ah,
Verdi ate frog risotto, Verdi ate frogs. There's a cookbook of, we know Verdi's recipes. We know what he cooked because he was very precise about all that. And this non-touristic, non-La Dolce Vita world, but the world of real farmers, of meditative people, of poets, of creative people who were happier on their own than
right.
being surrounded by, in the fashion shows of Florence and or the fanciness of Venice. You pick your city. These were the Italians who we don't see, and these were Verdi's people.
Right. I think he identified as a farmer. He talks
Yeah,
about that.
yeah,
I'm a farmer.
yeah,
And I also think his love of nature that was so rife in his operas and in his life came from living on the land like that.
yeah.
Really important. I know that. I love this. You know this, Fred, because I know you everything about Verdi, but every time he finished an opera, he would plant a different tree. So,
Yes,
for when he finished La Traviata, he planted a willow tree.
right.
When he, it was, I love these stories about him.
And the Villa Sant'Agata, which was the name of his farm, is still there. It was nearly lost, frankly. It's a long political situation, but with the help of Dominique Mayer, who just ended his tenure at La Scala, and with the help of people at La Scala, and with the help a little of me and a lot of people love Verdi, um, they managed to save it. And it's going to be turned probably into a foundation, but it was too precious to lose. But
Oh,
one of the things that's so amazing is that his favorite dog is buried there on a little hill
right.
outside the house. And
Yes.
the plants are all there where he planted them. He imported many plants into Italy that had never been in Italy before, like a banana tree, the first banana tree, the first, I figured, persimmon papaya, it's a pea fruit. But one of those, the first one was there. So the amazing thing now is that you can go there and the plants that he planted are still there. and bees are still there, and they make a honey that
Mm.
whenever I go there, I buy some of the honey because these bees feed off the plants that Verdi planted. So there's no more direct connection that I can feel to that man apart from his music than eating honey made from the plants that he planted
So cool.
175 years ago.
I love
It's
that
stunning.
idea.
Yeah,
You know about his teepee also that's made of ivy on
yeah,
his property,
yeah,
um, Villa Agita. Yeah, it's really stunning. He would go in there and meditate and write. And we spent time there. We were so lucky to have access to all of Verdi's places.
right.
His home, as you said, Ranuncola and St. Agatha. Really beautiful. And it's throughout the film. You can see that. And some of my favorite part is when we go to Villa Agata. It's
Yeah,
stunning. You feel him, you see him, and it's all of his hat, his scarf, his gloves, all the books that he read.
yeah.
Stuff. Yeah.
And his records and his scores. And I'm sure they let you into the so-called private wing that the public doesn't see. And
Yeah.
that's a remarkable area too, because it contains many of his possessions and so on. I was given the privilege once. I was doing I think, a lecture or an article about the fact that Verdi and Wagner only crossed paths once, and it was in Bologna. Wagner was conducting his opera Lohengrin, and Verdi slipped into a box at the Teatro Comunale in Bologna and had the score and made markings in the score. If I remember correctly, it's a number of years, he made 104 comments. And I read the original score that he held and read all 104 comments while reading the Lohengrin score. Um, but he decided to slip out and not meet Wagner. Not for any emotional reason, but I think he just felt it's better that we are just in our separate poles as we are. And he was greatly admiring of Lohengrin. He'd never heard something like that. And you could certainly argue that some of his later operas, especially Otello, were influenced by the Wagnerian through composed style that Verdi would have heard in Lohengrin and other Wagnerian works. So, as I've said to you, I've said to everyone, he's my hero. Love him. I won't say
Me
he's
too.
my favorite composer, although he's a magnificent, fantastic composer, and I happily go anytime. But as a man, he is my hero. And you, I think, get that and you manifest that so well in the way you've come to express him and his world. And that's part of why I asked you to join me here today.
Uh, yeah, I feel so blessed and honored to be have the responsibility of showing that beautiful heart, that beautiful man to the world. Because I think through his work, not only his music, which is, I know our film is wall-to-wall music of Verdi and others too, but mostly Verdi, and to hear that and to see this what he called his most beautiful work, Casa
Yeah.
Verdi.
Let me open up più bella, he said.
Right. That's right.
Opera in Italian means work. So therefore, it's not opera the way we say opera. It means
That's right.
opera.
That's right. What a blessing. I feel. But as I said, it goes back to when I have this karma with Verdi because when I was at Universal as an executive, and Jim Katz, who is I feel the godfather of this film in many ways of Viva Verdi because he had Universal Classics and he
Mhm.
was brave and bold enough years ago in the 80s to bring in Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, Zoot Suit, La Traviata. And I was in New York at that time at Universal, and not everybody understood opera or wanted to work on an opera film. And I said, I'll
Mhm.
take it. I would love that. And so I got to work with Franco Zaffarelli, became nice friends with him, and learned so much and learned more about Verdi, consequently, of doing that. So
Yeah.
to me, I have great karma with Verdi.
So I want to open another topic with you because I've never had this opportunity with someone as qualified as you are to do this. Um, when I teach opera and I try to interest people in opera, most people I'll ever meet love movies. And I try to explain that opera was the art form that most directly influenced cinema. It was not theater, it certainly was not ballet, It was not poetry, not literature, it was opera. Because opera has had and has the capacity for great pictures, for great stories, and has a linguistic element and a musical element. The only difference is that in opera, the musical element predominates, and in cinema, the spoken element predominates, but both work together. If you
Mhm.
look at a film by Fellini or by Steven Spielberg or Martin Scorsese, there are certain directors who work with musicians, and music is an integral part of their films. But similarly, the great divas, the great movie stars of the pre-cinema age were the opera singers. And
Mhm.
we looked at them with reverence. If you looked at, in my case, Ingrid Bergman, and
Mhm.
then you'd look at someone, a great diva from the 1870s, a Swedish superstar, whatever. There was a direct connection. The way these people seemed both remote and accessible in the way they moved our lives and our feelings was very particular, which is why it was interesting. I didn't love the film Maria, but it was very interesting. I loved Angelina Jolie's portrayal of Maria Callas. I think she really captured that personality and that.
Didn't you like the concept of what Pablo
No,
Larraín
no.
uh,
I'll tell
did?
you why I didn't. I'll tell you why I didn't. Um, I think it sort of took opera tropes for
Uh,
people who don't know opera and said, "Oh, this is what opera is about." I think
uh-huh.
the film, and full disclosure, I worked on it. That best captured what opera does for people is Moonstruck. Um,
Ah,
I was a consultant on that, and um, I think that they really, you could see how Nicolas Cage, the sullen, angry baker who lost a
absolutely.
hand, takes Cher, who had never
Ah,
been to an opera, and the music of Puccini swells up, and the wonderful line when Cher says, "Is everybody would." I knew she was sick. I didn't know she was going to die. Is a very funny line, but it also says everything about how opera takes you to emotional places that most things don't, even
right,
nowadays. And therefore, the issues that are raised in opera are much more about real life, so that I'm sure that Ai Weiwei's Turandot um, had a lot of that intentionally or not, because it's about us. And all these operas, if you see Carmen or Don Giovanni or Elisir d'Amore, you name it, any Peter Grimes, you name it, um, this connects to who we are as people. And when people who don't know opera go to it and open themselves to it and don't expect a literal story, such as how could those two 50-year-olds possibly be believable as 23-year-old lovers? Well, because love is love is love. And the
mhm,
music is what expresses it. So in opera, the music takes the lead with the words come along. In cinema, the words take the lead and music comes along. And the great artists in both genres managed to do both. Also, the way that early film directors, especially silent films, could create imagery that came right out of opera. And the initial acting that was a bit this and that came right out of opera. But the
right.
difference was with silent films in early cinema, you could do close-ups. So you could see Greta Garbo's eyes as she reacted, or you could hear Betty Davis's voice as she replied, or any one of the great actors. Frederick March was another one, Spencer Tracy in the early 30s, who managed to capture all kinds of emotions. Cary Grant for the glamour, Fred Astaire for the dance, and Ginger Rogers. Um, all of these had correlates to what was in opera and entertainment before. And if you can embrace cinema, and most people do, then you can embrace opera. If you love opera, then it opens the door to understand what cinema took and ran with, because opera fostered technology. Opera was always the revolutionary art form. It was the first for radio transmission. It was the first for recordings. It was the first for illumination. It was the first for the technology that made opera possible. And then that evolved into the technology that became cinema. To take it further, and I hadn't thought of this until just now, the Lumiere brothers did their presentation of their first film, which I believe was the train coming out of the tunnel, on the Rue Scribe in Paris. The Rue Scribe, if you go one block north, that's the Paris Opera.
Mm.
So that they chose, I believe, to present it near the Paris Opera to show that opera is
Connection.
the great art form of today, but cinema will be the art form of tomorrow. And next time you go to Paris, the Hotel Scribe faces just diagonally the opera, the old Paris Opera, the Palais Garnier,
Yeah.
and which only opened in 1875. So we're only talking about a 20-year difference between the Paris Opera and the Lumiere brothers. But it happened first in Paris and then came to New York and London and Berlin and Moscow and later Los Angeles, where opera came late to Los Angeles, but cinema, of course, is, it's your hometown. And
Right.
so
But
I
I
yeah,
always say that opera is a metaphor for life, and so it's just a bigger view of it. And I love that you brought up Norman Jewison, who was one of a dear friend of mine
mhm.
in February last year, and we would talk about Moonstruck all the time because people responded to that because it was bigger than life and it was operatic. You're so
Yeah.
right.
But
Perfect.
also it was when we were working on the Turandot production. I was performance manager at the Met, responsible for the theater, and
Ah,
we had a break of a few days between the end of the opera season and the beginning of the ballet season, and we closed the theater and we had the film company come in
ah,
and did the filming, and they had
me.
me talk to Cher about the operas, that
Ah,
especially La Boheme, and Nicolas Cage and Vincent Gardenia, who played her father, he knew opera. He was an Italian from New York. Anita Gillette played the mistress. I don't want to give everything away, and she wanted to know the story. So I would sit with them in the Met cafeteria and talk about La Boheme, talk about the Metropolitan Opera, talk about its meaning to people in New York, talk about the fact that Cher, a girl from Brooklyn, would dress up and come to Lincoln Center Plaza and
yeah,
enter the Metropolitan Opera House and enter this world that she didn't know. And it was in her own city, about five
right.
miles from where she lived. And the only one I didn't meet was Olympia Dukakis, who played her mother, because she did not go to the opera in the movie.
Right.
But it's La Boheme became a metaphor for so much, and in the opera and in the movie rather. And but what I loved is they used the feeling, but they didn't sort of have a checklist of opera
Yeah.
cliches. There were
Yeah.
no fat ladies. There was none of that. A little bit of, this very well about movie making, is that for different reasons they would not allow the Zeffirelli Boheme production to be filmed. So therefore, what they did was Norman Jewison was Canadian, I believe.
That's
They
right.
they filmed the reaction shots to the production in New York at the Met on
Ah,
House Right in the parterre. And they had the camera set up in the orchestra level and above, and Cher and Nicolas Cage sat in the box. Um, they the opera production, which was, if I recall, the voices were Renata Tebaldi and Carla Bergonzi, were both from near Parma. Um, but the production was the opera company in Toronto. So what you saw was people running around on the stage, walking around on the stage in Toronto, the
mhm.
voices coming from Italy, and Cher and Nicolas Cage reacting to what they did not see because there was nothing on the Met stage.
Right.
So I was the opera whisperer, so to speak, who told them what they would be seeing and hearing in
Ah,
Toronto and New York. And it was a thrill to do that. But
oh, God,
I
I
also
love.
loved how they captured what we used to call the come in, where the audience would arrive and they had an overhead shot of people entering. They had the intermission, they had the ushers with the hand chimes, they had the check room after, where there's a famous encounter. I don't want to spoil the movie for people, And this is just one scene in a big movie
Right.
that opera influenced in different ways. And they had, I believe his name was Fyodor Chelyapin, who was the son of the great Chelyapin opera singer, play an old Italian man. So there
Mm,
was all of this opera DNA in the movie without
right.
their showing it. So that John Patrick Shanley's script could be
Yeah.
about an Italian family and their
Right.
relationships, but how opera was always at the fringes. And
Right.
that you grew up in an Italian home, I'm guessing. And therefore there was that it was always there, even if it was not front and center.
Right. And the drama of that family was just like the drama on any stage as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
Yeah.
Because there was jealousy and
Yeah.
two brothers vying for one
Yeah.
woman and a mother allegedly dying in Sicily, and so the brother goes home. El
Gotcha.
miracolo, she survived, and then they come back, and meanwhile she's fallen in love with the other brother. Um, and then there's betrayal on the parents' level, and the mother, in a famous scene, cooks because what else would you do? And she and her daughter sit down, having just cooked. They eat and they talk at the kitchen table, and all of that was so real for Italians, for Italian Americans, but also for opera lovers. That's why I felt that it's the best opera movie. It was not about opera. And it was not a film of an opera. It was not La Traviata or Otello, where you pick the opera, where that's a different thing. The Met does these wonderful transmissions around the world of opera in HD, which is direct from the stage of the Metropolitan Opera. Vienna, La Scala, many companies do it. Um, but it was a film, Moonstruck was, where opera was in the blood of all the characters, but it was not about opera.
Right. It's
And
my
that's why,
favorite, one of my favorite movies, along with Black Orpheus, actually.
oh,
And
yeah,
the Black Orpheus at Casa Verde, when I was interviewing a lot of the residents there, this beautiful black man, um, uh, Denanino, and we were just interviewing him and saying, what have you done, in the world of opera? He said, "Oh, I was in the film Black Orpheus," and
yeah,
he was in Rio, and we
yeah.
started the beautiful music from that gorgeous movie. Yeah,
Which is based on the Orpheus myth, which is the most told story in opera history, beginning in 1607 and up to today. And not only Orpheus, but now they do operas about Eurydice, finally. Um, so that which premiered in Los Angeles, the opera about Eurydice. And so therefore, Black Orpheus is the story set in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. A wonderful film, I agree with you. So opera is part of who we are. If you try to categorize it, and I know you wanted to talk to me about one more thing, um, if you wanted to categorize it as being separate from life, you're not doing yourself a service, you're not doing opera service. Now, you want to talk to me about the universal frequency found in the A, the ah.
yes, this is my
Okay,
favorite thing
go for
because
it.
I'm a spiritual girl, and I love that Verdi also was involved in that world of metaphysics in a way because he wrote all of his opera in 432 hertz, which
Mhm.
is the universal frequency, and it's the tuning of the amen in the om. And he and Mozart both, Fred, I know you know all of this stuff, but it's the most exciting thing to me that he wrote in that. And then the regular opera was changed, the tuning was changed to 440, which
Wow.
is not such a copacetic or easy frequency. The 432 is the one that gives relaxation, it gets rid of anxiety. It's one of those frequencies. You know about this, Fred. Talk to me about it. I love that it's very.
Well, I don't know that much about it in that I'm not in that degree of musicology, but I do know that at the Juilliard School, there's I forget what frequency they use, but when they do Baroque and early music, they tune their instruments to a particular frequency. What this is about, and again, this is not my bailiwick. If we're talking about Verdi or Pasta, I could help you, um, but basically the tuning at which instruments and music is tuned, so to speak, um, affects slightly the pitch, slightly the vibration between
Right.
the musical instruments and the singers on the stage, or if it's an all orchestral performance, how it's received in the auditorium. I would want to, maybe I'll have a guest on sometime who could talk about that because it's not, I'm always
Yeah.
supposed to say, if I don't know something, I say I don't know it. And I'm just barely familiar with that. I just
Yeah.
know
It's the
the
heart
headline.
chakra. They say it's the heart chakra, that
Yeah.
430. And he wrote all of his operas in that. He knew, he understood. He was very evolved to me. He was a ascendant master to me. He knew
One
a
of
lot.
my favorite lines from Verdi is, I think, from his opera Ernani, Ogni cor serba un mistero. Every heart harbors a mystery.
Uh,
And I agree with you when you talk about the heart chakra, that
mm,
as well as we think we may have known him, if he wrote Every Heart Harbors a Mystery, it means that we can think that we understand one another, we can feel empathy and compassion for one another, but every one of us has within us a mystery. And, people talk endlessly about every one of their feelings, and they use common language that everybody, when I say common, I don't mean rude, I mean words that are familiar, like spaces and places and so on, whatever the current word is. Um, but ultimately, each one of us has that inner spirit, the vita interiore, as the Italians say, the inner life that can never be defined, that can only be shared in the right places at the right time with the right people. Um, I recently was a mentor to someone who was here studying, and I felt that he and I had this understanding where
mm.
we didn't have to explain things to one another, that I could speak in shorthand to him about his topic, which was the environment and nature and then the rights of nature. And he didn't have to be explained to from me because whatever my particular mystery was perhaps corresponded to his. I'm not talking about a love relationship. I'm talking about a human understanding between two people. Um, that we just got each other. And he's back in Europe now. But the thing is that I like it that way, that every heart harbors a mystery. I don't want to
Mhm.
change that. I don't think we can define everything. We shouldn't try to define everything.
We shouldn't try. I agree with you.
Yeah,
That's the attraction,
yeah,
that mystery and magic of the
yeah.
art as well. That's what I feel about artists.
It's
You
true.
you get a glimpse.
So, Christine Lamont, I don't know if we left anything out, but this was a lovely
I could
conversation.
talk to you forever, Fred. You're one of my
And
favorite people.
thank you. And so, Christine, officially, I'm going to say thank you very much. We don't say good luck in opera. We say toy, toy, toy in opera. It's not good luck to say good luck, so we say toy, toy, toy. In nel culo della balena, as the Italians say, in bocca lupo, um, and all of those good auguries that we say in Italian for your films. And I look forward to seeing more. And I really, in addition to the opera subjects I care about, I look forward to seeing Figli del Fiume about the Po River because it's that's part of my mystery would be my connection to that place.
You'll
So I
love that.
thank you very much, Christine.
Grazie mille, Fred. This was
Thank you.
great.